Hi, my name is Chuck Gardner. This is another one of my thought-provoking photography tutorials in which I try to explain the underlying why to all the how-to instructions that you will get on YouTube in short videos. My introduction to photography was with the Kodak system. George Eastman popularized photography for the masses by producing a system of graded papers. A photographic paper has a fixed tonal range like a digital sensor. Only one of those ranges matched the negatives taken on a sunny day. On cloudy days or overcast or open shade, what you would have is a mismatch between the scene illumination and the contrast range of the paper. So Eastman's solution was to come up with 4 different grades of paper. That allowed your great-grandparents to take their Brownie camera and take pictures outside in the sun and indoors with flash and in the shade, wherever they wanted to take pictures. Then the film, originally what you had to do if you had a Brownie camera is you had to send the entire camera to Rochester, New York via the post office, where they would unload it in a darkroom, develop the film, and then what the lab technician would do is they would use a densitometer, which is a light measurement device that measures the incident versus the transmitted light. And the ratio between the incident and the reflected, the logarithm of the ratio, becomes the density unit. So if you have 100 units of illumination and only 1 go through, the log, that is a 1 to 100, and the log of that is 2. Well, the range of a negative for printing a sunny 16 scene was a log density of 3.0 or 3.1. So that was what the system was calibrated against. And the technician would then measure the negative, and he'd find a shadow area and then find a highlight or a skin tone. And that range between the highlight and the skin tone would tell him which grade paper to set the machine for. It was automated, and so that was how photography was done for the masses. Now, that wasn't how it was done originally. Originally, if you wanted to be a photographer, and my relatives go back in photography, back to the earliest days of photography. I've got photo albums in my man cave with pictures from the early 1900s because my grandfather had a darkroom and he was a photographer hobbyist, and so was my father, and so was probably my great-grandfather. Photography has been in my family for generations. Back in the day of the Civil War, Gardner was one of the Civil War photographers, not related to me, I don't think, but they carried around glass plates that they had to coat themselves, and then they would make their prints by sandwiching the glass plates with a sheet of photographic paper. They also coated themselves and exposing it to sunlight. There was no enlarger. It was direct contact from these amazing detailed 8 by 10 and larger glass negatives. Now, the way it evolved with sheet film was that the original sheet film was orthochromatic. What orthochromatic means in practical terms is that it's not sensitive to red light. That's what allowed it to be developed. The negatives could be developed by eye in the darkroom. This is how Ansel Adams and Edward Weston and all of that era of photographers learned the craft of photography. They would go out with their sheet film cameras and expose using the Sunny 16 rule, which is very predictable. Sunlight's always the same, so the exposure is always the same. And there was also a rule for shade and open shade and overcast. And there was a chart that was printed on the box. That's how I learned exposure. I didn't have an exposure meter on my first camera. So what the photographer would do is they were using sheet film, so they would, expose the picture, the negative, then they would take it back in the darkroom, and they could actually develop it by eye in the tray and pull it out of the tray when they saw the density range was correct for the range paper. That's how Adams learned, and that's how Adams continued to use sheet film with his zone system. The only difference was that in the late 1920s, early 30s, film switched to panchromatic. Panchromatic sees the entire spectrum. So now you could photograph accurate color renditions, but with a catch. You could no longer develop the film under safe lights in the darkroom. And that's when the process became more systematic, because you had to know a consistent temperature, use a consistent temperature, usually 68 degrees was the standard, 68 to 70 degrees, because that was what room temperature was. And then you had to keep track of the time of the negative development. That was done with a timer in the darkroom. So that's how Adams adapted his system. But unlike the Kodak system, where you change paper grades depending on the lighting condition, what Adams chose to do is change his development times to match the lighting, which is what they had been doing under the old system. When they developed by eye, if it was a sunny day, the negative would have more contrast, and they would develop for a shorter time. If it was overcast, like today, the negative would be thinner, and you had to develop longer to get that 3.0 range for the number 2 paper. So that was the basis of the Adams zone system. Now, the confusing thing about the zone system was originally Ansel Adams, who was trained as a concert pianist, he only put 10 zones in the system, one for each finger. Zone 0 was pure black, the blackest black you could have in the scene, which would be reproduced as a 2.0 density on the print. And the lightest zone here, white, was his zone 9. And the zones weren't f-stops. That's the thing that confused everybody about the zone system. They thought zones were f-stops. Zones were not f-stops. They were simply an arbitrary division of this tonal scale. This is a Kodak grayscale. This is a Kodak grayscale. This is a Stauffer control wedge, which we used in graphic arts. There's 20 steps on this one. I'm not sure how many steps on this one. This one is very orderly. Each one of these steps is a 0.15 density difference. This can be used, this was the exposure meter for graphic arts. You would put this on your copyboard when you shot a halftone or a line shot, and where the litho film went from clear to solid, this was your exposure meter. I taught my college class on photolithography. I structured the syllabus entirely around this as the process control tool. That was how I got my teaching job. Now, in this 1964 edition, this is a 1968 reprint of the 1964 edition. I'll do an inset here of the forward. in which Ansel Adams recognizes that he made a mistake by only putting 10 zones for his 10 fingers. He divided it into 10 even slices, and those 10 even slices weren't f-stops, they were narrative definitions of scene content that you would look for in the original scene and reproduce them on the print. A print is just an illusion of reality. And the mistake he made when he set up his zone system with only 10 zones was that this white zone, this 98% reflectant white, solid white, he said that was zone 9, and this was zone 0 in black. So that's 10 zones. The problem is he forgot to assign a zone to specular highlights. Specular highlights, I came to realize when I started using flash, those specular highlights are the only clues in a two-dimensional reproduction of shape in a smooth, flat, white object. So if you're photographing a white car or a white dinner plate in a table setting for a food ad, and if you blow out the specular highlights on that white dinner plate, it looks like a white blob. Same thing with a white car. If you blow out the specular highlights, what are specular highlights? Specular highlights are the reflection of your flash. The reason you put a diffuser on the flash or pop up that little white panel on your flash, that is to create a catch light in the eyes of your subject. Why do you want catch lights in the eyes of your subject? Because that gives three-dimensional shape and life to eyes. So Ansel Adams, by the time he wrote this book, amateurs had started to adopt his system. Everybody was buying 4x5 cameras and doing the zone system, but they were screwing it up because of him not assigning a zone to specular highlights. Now, I'm a highly intuitive INTP type, and I recognized immediately reading Adams' books that he was also an INTP. And we just jumped to intuitive conclusions. And, to Adams, it was obvious that, hey, the white paper base is going to be your specular highlights. So he didn't even think to assign it a zone until, I guess, the next edition after this one, where he assigned it zone 10. So now you have an 11 zone system instead of a 10 one, which is like adding an extra finger to play more notes on a piano. It doesn't make any sense. What would have made more sense if Adams was a mathematician instead of a musician was to use the hexadecimal system and use 16 zones, because that's how digital photography is devised. Your histogram is an 8-bit representation of the analog data that's collected in the sensor. What the camera does is it collects voltage in those little cells that have RGB filters over them. They accumulate voltage. Then the logic of the camera looks at the voltage in each one of those cells, and originally, in the original digital cameras, it converted it to a value between 0 and 255. That is 10 to the 8th, or 8-bit color. So when you look at your camera, and the original cameras had 8 bits per channel, that meant that there were 256 discrete tones between black and white on the luminance range on each one of those RGB channels. Now, the problem with 8-bit color in the early cameras was that when you had a sky, a gentle transition like a sky, there was such an abrupt difference between those discrete digital values that you actually get lines, banding in the image. And that was a problem with early cameras. And that's one of the reasons why in the cameras, they put a filter over the sensor. It was called an anti-aliasing filter. And what that did is it broke up the pattern. Also, the early sensors have the UV sensors on them. It blocks the UV light because the sensors are sensors in a digital camera. If they don't have UV and infrared filters on them, can see a wider spectrum than the human eye. Numbers of channels in the color, that's changed as the computer processing got more powerful in the cameras. My first camera, my first Canon DSLR, was the Canon 20D. The 20D was 8.2 megapixels, which was good enough to print a 300 dpi 4x5 print, every bit as good as my film cameras. And, you know, with good processing, post-processing, you could get away with a really good-looking 5x7, and sort of, you know, by the time you'd made an 8x10 print from an 8 megapixel camera, you know, you started to notice that it wasn't as sharp. But with digital, you didn't have the optical path of the enlarger messing up the image, and you had unsharp masking and different digital tricks you could use to sharpen the image. So then the next camera I bought in 2008 was the Canon 50D. By then the resolution had gone up to 15 megapixels, but the real reason that I got it was that they had changed the sensor technology. Instead of having square wells for the sensor, they had made the wells cone-shaped, which increased their volume. It is the volume, they're like buckets that fill up with photons. And this innovation in the chip allowed it to absorb more photons in the highlights before they maxed out, which meant you expand the digital range. So it had a stop or two more dynamic range than my 20D, plus it had 10-bit color. 10-bit color was a bonus because now there were 1,024 discrete steps per channel, enough to eliminate the banding problem. The camera that I'm photographing this video with is a Canon R6 Mark II, which is 24 megapixels and 14-bit color. 14-bit color is got discrete channels than the eye can resolve. So it's more than enough to get you perfectly smooth gradations. That's why digital photographs are so much better today. But I digress. So let me get back to Adams.